Hi there, I'm Samuel Doveri Vesterbye, the director of the European Neighbourhood Council and the host of MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today, we're continuing our deep dive into the MEDIATIZED EU project, a 4-year initiative funded by the European Union through the Horizon program. This project brings together partners from 7 countries: Belgium, Ireland, Portugal, Estonia, Hungary, Georgia, and the country we'll discuss today, Spain. In previous episodes, we've kind of looked at early stages of our research, discussing the key findings from our desk research, policy scoping report, media analysis, shared insights from interviews, and also with the political and media elites in each country, shedding light on the dominant discourses about the EU and their influence on policymakers and journalists. And so at this point, our teams have already conducted the nationwide surveys and held discussions with various groups. And we have findings which are very rich in perspective on the state of debate surrounding the European project and also how it's represented in general. And so today I'm joined by my colleague from Spain, Dr. Sonia Boulos, who is Associate Professor in International Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Law and International Relations at the Antonio de Nebrija University. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Sonia will discuss the findings from the country and also offer kind of deep insights into, how is the EU portrayed there, as well as, what kind of policy recommendations are available. And so let me start by welcoming you, Sonia, and thanking you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Let me jump right in with the first question. So what were the key findings from Spain, and how is Europeanization perceived?
Okay, so I assume you already discussed this with other partners in the project. We have different stages: media analysis, interviews with media and political elites, and public opinion survey. So looking at all this together, in a way, our research reaffirms what we already know about Spain, that it's a country that there's a strong pro-European sentiment among political elites and also among the public, generally speaking. So this is what was confirmed in our research. To understand the outcomes of this research, you have also to take a little bit historical perspective on the conditions under which Spain joined, the European integration project. And it happened right after the death of the dictator Franco. So for Spaniards, joining the European integration project had a very important symbolic meaning. It was seen that as almost the only path to democracy and modernization of the country. So the debates about joining the European communities at the time was pretty much shaped by ideological debates and even identity questions that to highlight that Spain is part of Europe, and Spain is part of Europe because it shares the core values of the European integration project. Now, with time, after it become member, things start changing, because suddenly when you're a member, it's not like you're debating membership. So you can see that the emphasis becomes more pragmatic in the sense of, talking about specific policies of the EU that impact Spain and Europeanization in general. So, for example, in the media analysis, when we try to identify major discourses, you see that major discourses focuses on key events that were taking place, policies in relation to COVID, economic recovery, migration, and in the last stage of the media analysis, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So suddenly the kind of symbolic discourses are replaced by more pragmatic discourses focusing on specific issues. However, when we started the interviews, and even in the part of the media analysis, you see that also identity-based issues are still, there. They did not disappear after more than 4 decades of membership. It is reflected in, for example, supporting the measures adopted by the EU to sanction governments that deviate from the, normative framework, focusing on human rights and the rule of law. that there is strong support for these measures among elites. And this support is also framed with identity-based arguments that we fully support the European values. The European values are our values. So in a way, these discourses did not disappear entirely. They pop up whenever, there's an opportunity. Another thing that was interesting now that we found, now Spain is a highly polarized country, politically speaking, which is also reflected in the media. But given the fact that the European integration project was a consensual project that was supported by all political parties at the time, and it continues to enjoy a very high support among political elites from the left and from the right, so that means that the Europeanization itself is not a polarizing issue, in the sense that there's no debates whether we should like that the membership is beneficial for us or not beneficial. The assumption is that yes, this is something that Spain fully supports. So there's no polarization on the EU, although there's high polarization on other issues. However, that does not prevent the instrumentalization of the EU. In what sense? That even though the EU itself is not a contested political project, it can be used as a leverage to attack political opponents by accusing them, for example, of deviating from the European course. For example, accusing the government that it's not handling the recovery funds appropriately. Or in the interviews, for example, accusing the government for not following certain normative frameworks of the EU. So still, even if the European project itself is not contested, it can all the time be used, instrumentalized to gain political gains internally. Another thing that we saw in the analysis, both the media analysis and also the interviews, that people still have a memory of the austerity measures that hit Spain very hard. So there's, we can still see the critique of these measures in the discourses today about the next generation funds and the recovery funds. They're constantly compared with the old austerity measures, with the austerity measures being highly criticized and the new approach of the EU being praised as something that should have been happening long time ago. So that's important to take that, even though many years have passed and things look much better now for the EU in terms of public opinion, and also people being more confident about the project, still there's like this memory of these measures still there in the discourses, at least about financial issues. So that's basically, the major finding. It's still pro-European country. The EU is not a contested project, but it could be instrumentalized internally, also at the interstate level. So a lot of time, the debates, for example, about countries from Eastern Europe is also kind of, you take the EU as a leverage to create this distinction between us and them, that we are the true representatives of European values, whereas ultra-national governments deviate from the European course. In a way, this discourse too tries to reassert, the argument that Spain is, truly European. It's at the heart of the European integration project because it's a strong defender of its values. So these are the basic points that
And when you look at the findings from Spain and you compare them with findings from other countries, having also looked at the different partners' findings, I saw a lot of similarities. Like, for example, there seemed to be more trust in EU institutions than in national institutions. There seems to be some similarities occurring across different countries. How have you viewed that?
One of the things that you see, even in countries where the European project itself is polarized. For example, if you take the example of Georgia, so there's because of proximity to Russia, that it could be a very polarizing project. But even within this context, because there's a perception that the population supports, joining the EU, all the political actors use the EU as an instrument to attack each other by accusing each other of deviating or being responsible for the country deviating from its European. So instrumentalization, it was evident in more than one context, or trying to use the EU to gain more points locally. That's something that we saw in many places. Now, the point that you mentioned, and I'm glad that you bring this up, that in most countries, the EU institutions scored higher levels, points for trust. Meaning, in most countries, the constituency seem to trust European institutions more than their own local government or national actors. But at the same time, this finding should be, qualified. In the interviews, for example, with media and political elites, especially with media elites, there's this, and also some political, some members of political elites, and also part of the surveys could show that pro-European sentiment, even strong pro-European sentiment, could coexist with low level of knowledge about the EU. So on one hand, you could be very pro-European, but at the same time, not understanding, a lot of things that you need to understand about how the EU functions. So you could say that, like, read this carefully in what sense? And we had this debate, with some of the people we interviewed, not debate, like it was the exchange to listen to them, that a higher level of trust in EU institutions could also be related to the fact that people don't know much about what's going on in the EU. So it's easier to trust, institutions that you don't know much about, as opposed to your national government, that there's always news. So the lack of coverage, lack of serious debates about the EU itself could create this situation where the, lack of knowledge and strong pro-European sentiment exist at the same time. But the question is, what are the implications for the long run?
And it also begs the question of, maybe it's a relative problem. Like, how distrustful are people of their own governments? Maybe it's so bad that the EU starts looking good.
Yeah, but in some countries that the difference wasn't that great. Like some countries you could see very, like, a gap. In other countries, like the EU scored slightly higher than so yes, eventually it depends on the context. But it's important to take into consideration more than one point. First, which also we discovered when we have this deliberative events with the public to discuss the outcomes or the findings of the research project. For example, we had a meeting with our own students, and I'm talking about students who study international relations with other, international relations and law and journalism, economics, administration, etc. So these are they have a very unique profile in the sense there's the one you would expect that they would be more, knowledgeable of the EU. But even when talking to them, there was this sense that they don't know much about the EU, that they don't talk about European elections. They're not very kind of enthusiastic about participating. They feel that they don't know a lot about the EU. But at the same time, they're very pro-European. So this is something that we need to, think about a lot, because also the research suggests that more and more the people, especially younger generations, are not following traditional media to get their information about the world. They follow other channels to get their information. And at the same time, in most countries, in the public opinion surveys, people were aware or recognized that, they encountered disinformation. So taking all these factors together, that there's not high trust in the media. The consumption of the media is changing. The patterns of, are changing. Lack of knowledge about the EU and and disinformation problem. This could have an impact on pro-European or the position vis-a-vis the EU, because very strong pro-European sentiment that is not based on sufficient knowledge it's something that we need to think about, could change.
Absolutely. And what I also noticed, having done these podcasts with different partners and having also read the different reports, what I noticed is that the question of being pro-EU, anti-EU seems a bit simplistic from the results and findings that we've had across our different reports from different countries. I see that it's more stratified, right? So you can be pro-EU on certain things, you can be anti-EU on other things. Sometimes, at least in the case of Belgium, we saw like if you're more right-wing, actually you're not always anti-EU. You might actually be pro-EU on, I don't know, Frontex, or you might be anti-EU on something else, or you might be, if you're left-wing, you might be critical of the EU on human rights, but then you'll be on certain things related to illegal migration, et cetera, or on other things, you'll be pro-EU. So we saw at least a much more complex picture. How do you view that, and how do you see it across the countries?
I mean, we always critique is always welcome. I mean, any democratic political project assumes that critique is a healthy thing and should exist. So when we were working on media analysis or even the interviews, so you distinguish between outright Eurosceptic positions and between what is called soft Euroscepticism, that you're not against the European integration project, but you have some critique about certain policies. And actually, just to give you an example, in the case of Spain, sometimes the critique is aimed at strengthening the EU itself. For example, before Russia's aggression against Ukraine started, so we were analyzing, the discourses that appear in the media. We saw a lot of critique about the EU being too dependent on NATO and the United States for its security, especially after the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, that we should, that many would argue that we should take our security and, common defense more seriously. We cannot be depending on other actors. So it is a critical discourse, but the whole point of the discourse is to make sure that the EU has greater autonomy in geopolitical arena. So it's not aimed at, kind of shaking or changing. It's just simply like we're criticizing this because we want it to be stronger. That's one. Now, also in the case of Spain, for example, which was interesting, even the, political parties that are at the, let's say, more at the extreme, and I'm talking about the right, that you shared some of the ideological, positions with other, more extreme right-wing parties across Europe in terms of, gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights. So even their discourses, even when they criticize and saying the EU invents rights that do not exist, in some of the interviews, or by saying the EU was not justified in withholding funds from Poland and the Hungarian government. Even when they say that, there's no discourse on, okay, maybe we should leave, or the EU is like bad. It's just saying we should present a different vision of Europeanization. So it's like restructuring. There's no outright, confrontation with the project itself. So that was interesting in the case of Spain to see how this is, done.
And so, just out of curiosity, Sonia, if I may, now we have Donald Trump essentially in the White House in the United States, and he's been vocally anti-EU, and he's been reaching out to far-right parties like Geert Wilders, Orban, and so forth, often saying, negotiate directly with the United States, with the Trump administration, forget about the EU. So do you think in that context, the description you just made of the far right or the more right-wing part of Spain, would they then be more immune to that, or are they not?
The research that exists on this point, and in a way, our own research kind of reaffirms that eventually these parties have electoral consideration. And part of the electoral consideration is understanding that they operate in a country that it historically has been a very, supportive of the EU, that the constituency is very much pro-European. And I think, a clear confrontation with the EU, I find it hard to believe that that's an option they would opt for now, given the fact that they would know that it could have consequences in terms of, the results of, how many votes they can get, because I think they know it would be not very wise strategy in a country that it's, one of the strongest pro-European constituencies, that you start, saying things like, maybe, this is not the best project for us, that this could have a price. So there some research that we use also in our desk research, suggesting this, that electoral considerations are crucial to understanding this. And also our interviews confirm this, because even those who, could be mapped more on the, more extreme, right, would start about emphasizing that being European is something very important for them. It's part of their identity. They identify with the European integration project. And then they start criticizing. So I think, in Spain...
It's very interesting because, traditionally when you look at kind of like the development of identity, it's usually related to national identity or local identity and many other things. But the concept of especially the far right or more extreme political parties starting maybe to identify with a European conception of identity was just unheard of previously, really. So that's interesting.
It's interesting, but again, you have to. There are many commonalities between states, but there are many particularities and differences. As I mentioned before, in the case of Spain, the identity question was crucial. Spain was isolated for many years, not only because of the dictatorship, even before that, for historical political reasons. It was very isolated. It is on Europeanness was questioned, whether Spain or Spaniards are truly European. So when the transition to democracy starts, the discourses about, European values become central, because in a way they reaffirm that we are, how can I prove I'm European? By saying I fully endorse the values that I associate with Europe. At that time, they didn't speak much about human rights. The category was broader: democracy, development, but democracy in the sense of, liberal democracies that emerged after the Second World War. So identity factors here were, in a way, they were used in different ways that we see today. Today, identity factors are usually used by those who oppose the European integration project to say that it threatens the national identity, that it's, that the EU or liberal elites in the EU are imposing their gender ideology on us. They're inventing rights. They're, not paying attention to the real problems that exist, that, they're out of touch with reality and things like that. But at the same time, which was interesting, you still see traces of the other kind of discourse, that we're Europeans because we share core values. And those core values are, human rights, the rule of law, protection of minorities. So that becomes also in Georgia, for example, you see these kinds of discourses, and Estonia, that we're European because we endorse these values. So it's not a discourse that is appropriated by the identity discourse by extreme right, but it's also used by other, actors, which is interesting to see.
Absolutely. Let me ask my last question, which is, your team led the policy recommendation report, and so maybe you could just try to help outline what are the major points in those policy recommendation reports, and also who are you targeting with those recommendations?
Well, I want to focus here just on the recommendations that we said, we think that could be useful for the policymakers at the EU level, at the European level. And it's based on the research that we did. And, it was interesting to see, even though different teams framed it differently, but you can see a lot of commonalities. For example, Some teams argue that the EU should give more visibility for its values in discussions about the EU. And it comes from two places. For example, in the case, and it could be a recommendation coming from a country where the national identity is being used and, presented in a way that is kind of, conflicts with the European values. In countries where you see some actors saying that European, values, are just kind of some sort of liberal elites imposition. But also this recommendation comes from the country that you come from, Belgium, in which, there was a recommendation that the EU should engage more its own values because it's being criticized for deviating from its values in relation, for example, to the migration challenge by becoming too, securitarian in addressing migration and forgetting the human rights aspect of it. So it was interesting to see how this recommendation comes from kind of opposing positions. There were recommendations about the need of the EU to be more transparent, so people can understand how budgets are allocated, how they are used, how they are distributed. This would enhance, people's ability to understand how the EU functions. And for example, another recommendation that we saw almost with all teams, literally all teams suggested this, that the EU need to engage societies in debates to outreach more to the general public, initiating debates about common goals that are important at the EU level, how national interests and common goals benefit from it, could be beneficial for each other. So engaging the public. Media literacy also was a recommendation that we saw coming from all countries, that the EU needs to work on media literacy, not only for the public, but also for the media sometimes. To combat disinformation, of course, it's something that we saw in all teams. Improve communication strategies. Now, this also came in different forms. Improved communication strategies, taking into consideration different patterns of consumption, especially if we look at age gaps and generational differences, but also different communication strategies focusing on understanding that in certain countries you have different media based on linguistic differences that could be translated into something deeper. Some countries suggested that the EU should cooperate more with local institutions to better to be able to communicate better with national societies. In some countries, not all. For example, in the case of Georgia, there was a recommendation that the EU should push for certain internal reforms inside the country to guarantee freedom of the press and to guarantee that the civil society can function freely without intervention. So these are more or less, the kind of recommendations that were relevant to almost most teams when we were working on that. And sometimes you have, some recommendations that are very country specific. For example, in the case of the Hungarian team, to say that even if there are some measures against the Hungarian government for deviating from the European normative framework, be careful on how it is implemented so it wouldn't hurt, for example, the academic community. For example, in the case of Spain, now Spain is trying, it's obvious that from the media analysis, from following what the government has been doing, is trying to play a more visible leadership role within the EU. That is no longer wants to see itself, treated as the periphery, that it's one of the strongest economies in the EU. So it's pursuing a more visible leadership role. So these kinds of things should also be taken into consideration.
All right. Thank you so much, Sonia.
Thank you.
Yeah, essentially to an end of the discussion, I'm very happy that we've been able to go through especially the policy recommendation report, but also discussing the case of Spain. And first and foremost, thank you so much for taking the opportunity And for our listeners, if you're interested in finding out more about the project and the people behind it, just like Sonia, and also in order to access our summary of the key results and the findings of our research publication, all you have to do is visit our website, which is www.mediatized.eu, subscribe to our newsletter, and also follow us on social media like X or Twitter at mediatized_EU. Thank you.
Thank you.